The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz along with my co-host Tony Palmeri. And on this edition of Eye on Oshkosh, we're very pleased to be welcoming two folks from the Christine Ann Domestic Abuse Services. First, to my immediate left, is the Executive Director, Pamela Kimberly, and to her left is Amy Morrissey. Amy is the Client Services Supervisor for Christine Ann Domestic Abuse Services. Welcome very much to both of you.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure to have you here. This is the first time that, in the nearly 3 years we've been on the air, this is the first time that we've had anyone from Christine Ann, so welcome again. I guess maybe the first thing that we should do, I think most people in the area probably know or at least have heard of the Christine Ann Center. But why don't you give us a little bit of background about the shelter, and it's so much more than that, so tell us a little bit about what it is. Give us a history of your agency.
Yeah, last year we actually celebrated our 20th year in the community. We started the agency back in 1984, and at that time we were at Plainview. Parkview Health Center. And from then, back in the early 90s, then we moved over here to Algoma Boulevard, where the current shelter is. And it's so funny, people think that we're just the shelter, but really that's only about 20% of what we do within the community. Most of the services we provide are really to outside shelter clients.
Sure, and we'll talk a lot about that throughout the next 55 minutes or so. Now, you also have an office in Neenah, correct?
Yes, we do.
Is that a shelter also up there, or is that just administrative offices?
Well, it's administrative, but we also hold groups there. Okay. Our men's offender program is facilitated out of that office, and also we have teen advocates that meet with teens up there. So we do the same counseling services up there, although we don't shelter people. Okay. And we also cover Green Lake County, and we have an outreach office in Green Lake, rural county. But we don't, it's more of a group, the counseling piece of what we do, and the shelter. If someone needed shelter, they would come to Oshkosh.
Pam, why don't you talk about what your specific role is as Executive Director, and then we'll get Amy to talk about what your specific role is in your position.
Okay. My responsibility is to oversee all of the operations within Winnebago and Green Lake County, and that includes all the programs and services. It's making sure that the shelter accommodates the needs of the clients and victims seeking shelter from abuse. Also, the community awareness piece is mine, and the most grueling piece is looking for funding to support the programs, because we don't charge anything for any of the services. Everything's provided free of charge to the clients. The men's program, there is a sliding fee scale for the program, and most of them have been court ordered as a condition of their probation to participate in the program. But all of the other services are free.
Sure, and we're going to talk about how you're funded and that kind of thing in a little bit. Amy, tell us about your role.
Well, I work primarily in Oshkosh at the shelter itself. Excuse me. And anytime anybody comes into shelter, I meet specifically with that person at least once a week to talk about the dynamics of abuse, the cycle, things like that. We work a lot on the support plan, their goals, what they want to work on while they're staying in shelter, and primarily that is housing, employment, childcare, things like that, basically hooking them up with the resources that they've been isolated from while they were in that abusive relationship.
Go ahead.
Is there any length of time as to, how long someone is able to stay in the shelter itself?
Right now, we don't have a deadline policy. What we have kind of implemented is a 30-day review. So when I'm meeting with everybody once a week, I look at, are they following the rules and responsibilities of shelter? Are they working on their goals? Doing basically what they need to be doing to become self-sufficient again. And every 30 days, I look at, are you doing those things? And if that's not happening, then we sit down and we talk a little bit more about, okay, what needs to change? What can we help you with so that you can do those things? And if they aren't, then we would end up giving a deadline. But we always look at safety as the number one. So we try to work with the client as best we can to keep them in shelter until they can obtain housing.
So you don't just put someone out on the street if they've been there for 3 months or
No,
something like that.
no.
I mean, it would have to be kind of an egregious situation where they've really
Yes.
broken a
Yeah.
lot of rules or something.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've actually sheltered people for as long as 6 months.
Hmm.
You know, and when I look at the history of the organization, you know, in our early days, the average day of care was about 5 days of care. Now, last year, our statistics showed that we were at 42 days of care was really the average that someone stays in shelter. So,
What do you attribute that length of time to? I mean, other than the obvious, jobs are harder to find and housing's tougher to find.
right, and applying for assistance. The process now, expediting the process with W-2 takes quite a bit longer. So, you know, to get the financial resources that you need to become self-sufficient take a lot longer. Housing is an issue, you know, making sure that you have adequate housing for people. So the whole process to kind of stand strong and stand on your own 2 feet takes a lot longer.
I want to make sure we get this in. Who was Christine Ann? Lots of people in the community don't know who this person was.
Yeah, Christine Ann was a real person.
Yeah.
She had had contact with the shelter at one time during her life. She was murdered by her husband. It was one of the things that we talk about a lot when we're working with clients is how the violence escalates. And it typically escalates when someone's trying to leave a relationship or when there's an exchange, a physical placement exchange. And she was actually murdered during the exchange with her daughter, with her ex-husband. So, and her family, I know that when they did the capital campaign to build the shelter, were very generous in offering her name, you know, in memory of her to build the shelter. She was a very courageous person.
Right. Now, it does seem that in the 20 years that the shelter, has been around, its mission has expanded, correct?
Yes.
But that wasn't necessarily the goal of the shelter, correct? In other words,
You know-
functions have been forced on you, is that right?
Right. In fact, this whole movement has, you know, first of all, it was just safety. Let's make sure people have a place to go. I've talked to volunteers that on the early part of the movement, you know, the hospital would call them and they'd bring victims to their homes. I mean, there was really no safe place for people to go. So all of a sudden we have a safe shelter. Laws change, mandatory arrest changes. And that law kind of opened the door, and I had a rippling effect. We realized that more men were being arrested. We were serving probationary periods with some kind of behavioral treatment. And out of that, we created our men's offender behavioral treatment program. So we brought in, I believe the children's program started in 1991 as a result of seeing more kids. You know, we had these women in, but what were we doing for the kids to help them cope with all of this? So yeah, it has evolved, you know, to meet all the needs of the parts of the family that are affected by abuse.
What about Wisconsin Works, W-2? How has that changed the mission of the shelter?
You might be able to answer that.
I'm not really sure how it's necessarily changed the mission. I mean, we work very closely with W-2 for assistance with like food stamps, childcare, things like that. It's just a matter of hooking up the client with that particular resource. I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, I think you are, but in Wisconsin, would you know, is there any kind of exemption from W-2 if you are a victim of domestic violence? It sounds like there's not.
No.
And I think in some states, under their so-called welfare reform, there are exemptions to the procedures if you are a victim of
To
domestic
expedite
violence.
things, to get through the process. No.
Yeah.
Nope, I think the cases are considered all the same.
I know W-2 looks at specific barriers from employment, and domestic abuse is one of the ones that's listed on their on their criteria in order to receive assistance.
I guess where I'm going with this is, and neither of you may not know the answer to this. I mean, there might not be an answer to it. Has W-2 made what you do more difficult? right?
I think navigating the whole process is difficult.
It's more bureaucratic.
Right. Yep. And I think they've suffered some budget cuts as well.
Yeah.
So there's less people to help with the processing of the applications. You know, there's less dollars available. So I think overall it's stressed the whole system, and unfortunately the recipients are the ones applying are the ones that.
I think if W-2 wasn't in existence, it would be more difficult for the clients to get the services that they are getting.
Because?
Well, if they weren't getting food stamps from W-2, who would they get them from? You know,
Right.
if they weren't getting assistance for childcare, they can't go out and work. So if W-2 itself wasn't there, I think that it would be lacking within the community.
Sure.
You touched a moment ago, Pam, on really serving all aspects of the family.
Yep.
And one thing that I found interesting, and it's a good thing, is that one of the aspects of the family that you provide assistance for is finding placement, temporary placement for family pets, if they have them. And I think that is a little known secret about what you do, but it's an important part because abuse many times starts with an animal and then transcends into human abuse.
There's
Can
a
you talk
direct
little bit about that?
correlation. Yeah, there's a direct correlation between someone who would batter a pet and would probably, have the same behavior on a person, a human being. But what we found was we were always trying to assess what barriers there might be for someone to enter shelter, what things, in the rural community. Leaving the farm animals is huge. They don't want to, that's their livelihood. They become attached to the animals, and if they take shelter, the women or the spouse is a working component of that farm, and the animals could be hurt. The same thing that we find with people that come into shelter with pets. They'll stay because they don't know what to do with the dog when they leave, and they know that the batter has already been aggressive with the dog. So. And so we've worked out this great collaboration with the Humane Society and on an on-call basis, if they're not open on weekends, where they have foster families that actually take the pets for us, and they work out an arrangement so the clients can see the pets throughout the whole process while they're with us. And again, it's removed another barrier to come into shelter because they know they're safe, their kids are safe, and other pets are safe as well.
So I guess the underlying point and underscoring message here is if there's a situation where you're being abused, whether it's mental abuse or physical abuse, don't let anything stand in your way of getting help.
Right.
Make a call to you folks and let you help them navigate the waters.
Yeah, and I think an important component of that as well is you can make that call before you're ready to leave. Maybe you just need to process it. Something in your gut doesn't feel right, and you just need to talk to somebody. You're not ready to go. Just because you make that call doesn't mean you have to pack your bag and you're out the door.
Exactly.
The helpline is open 24/7, so 365. There's always an advocate on call that can, help you process things.
Can you, either of you, define domestic violence or abuse for us? Some people think it's only physical beating, but in fact that's not correct.
No, not at all. Domestic abuse, in larger explanation, I guess, would cover sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional, psychological abuse. The emotional abuse perspective, a lot of people, it's a gray area because there's no universal definition of emotional abuse.
Well, what would be an example, Amy, of a kind of emotional abuse that you would say a person should definitely make that phone call? Like a kind of emotional abuse that we won't that the average American doesn't necessarily recognize it as abuse.
Well, there's a whole continuum of emotional abuse. Some of the things that are on there, like jokes about habits, ridiculing family members, ridiculing a person's habits, religion, things like that. Anything that kind of raises a red flag for you and says, this doesn't feel right, is something that we want to point
What kind of effect
out.
do those things have on the victims of it?
It eats away at their self-confidence, at their self-esteem. It basically turns them into kind of a blank person. You feel so small, it just systematically wears you down where you feel like you have no identity any longer. And that's why emotional abuse is so horrifying.
So what do you do in a case like that? A person comes in and says, I'm not being physically beaten, but I'm being constantly put down, I'm being constantly berated, I'm being badgered, nothing I do is good enough. What do you say to a person like that?
Well, we would just, first of all, start out with probably the power and control wheel, which is one of the tools that we
let's
use.
talk about that.
Or I have an emotional abuse continuum that I use with people, and we just kind of point out and look through and, have these things ever happened to you within your relationship? Do these stand out? And a lot of times people will say, wow, I never even realized that was in fact abusive. So we just kind of start out there and talking about that, and then it's a slow process from there to basically get that message out of that person's head.
Can we talk about the power and control
Sure.
wheel? Let's just hold it up. Can we get a close-up on the power and control wheel? Right. As our camera operator, Mary Helen, is there we go.
I think it's
Talk
important.
about this for a bit. What
Yeah,
is
and
this?
it's important to know too that we're not giving people advice per se. We're giving them options.
Okay.
We're presenting theories that we know about and certain characteristics and dynamics that are constants in an abusive relationship, but we're not going to tell them to leave the relationship or whatever.
Never.
They're the ones that need to really assess whether they're in the right place.
Right. You try to get them to understand that they have options.
Right.
Exactly.
That there's things they can do. But the power and control wheel talks about using coercion and threats, economic abuse. What would that be?
Basically, preventing somebody from getting a job or keeping a job. There are tactics, maybe let's say you're working and I continually call you again and again and again. Well, eventually you're probably going to get fired. So in that way, that's kind of a control tactic. If you are working, maybe I'm expecting you to turn over your check to me
Right.
so that I can have control over it. It's all based on power and control over somebody else. All of the tactics that are on that page. And the emotional abuse continuum kind of goes off just that little square that talks about some of the tactics that are used. But everything on there is designed to basically cut somebody down to the point where they don't feel like they are worth anything. I have no options left, my opinion means nothing, and it's basically somebody else trying to push someone into their own frame. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Is there any research out there that suggests that a person who gets victimized this way is from a family in which they saw a parent victimized? Is there a correlation between that?
Yeah, there's a huge trend in generational abuse.
So the person
Because-
thinks it's normal.
Yes.
Because that's what they've been modeled. That's what that's the relationship they've seen between their mom and dad, or between their siblings, between their grandparents.
Definitely.
And that's why prevention education is so
Yes.
important. Planting that seed that you don't have to live in fear. People don't scream at each other all the time. There are healthy ways to have a relationship.
Well, what for a person for whom this is normal, they've seen it, but then they do find a way toward Christine Ann. Was there a breaking point that they reached? What do they find out from a friend or something that they don't have to do this? How does it work?
A lot of times they get to the point where they realize that this is enough. Nobody can define that for any one person. Everybody's different. Everybody's going to reach that point on their own, and that's kind of what's really stressful and frustrating for family members and friends, because they watch somebody going through this and they try to say, can't you see what's happening, or can you see that this is unhealthy for you or unsafe? And if they don't see it or aren't to that point that they want to get out, they're not going to. And so family and friends will often get frustrated, and we encourage those people to just be as supportive as possible and realize that that person will get there when they recognize it themselves.
Yeah, and what Amy's saying is absolutely true. By the time they get to shelter, a lot of times they've worn out their support system. They've moved in with mom 3 or 4 times. She says, I can't keep supporting you. You either make the decision to leave or not. But the dynamics and the components of being in an abusive relationship, particularly if it's emotional abuse, that love tie is so strong and so confusing that it's not, if someone robs you, you're not going to have a relationship with you because it's not an intimate relationship. It's that intimacy piece that keeps you kind of off balance. And
if there's children involved, that probably magnifies it.
and if you're financially dependent on that person, you can leave for a while and you've got X amount of dollars, and as soon as those run out, what's your next choice? It's to go back with it. You have a roof over your head and your children can get fed, and at least if there's abuse, at least you have a place to live right now.
And one more thing on this, Cheryl.
Sure.
Is it fair to say that for every one person who does contact you, there probably are 4, 5, 10 that should be contacting you that are not?
Yeah.
This is extremely underreported, correct?
Yes.
Well, it's behind closed doors. No one wants to talk about it. It's, keep it a secret. And this agency in particular, when they decided to set out and leave Parkview, they made a decision to become a visible part of the community and say, we're not going to hide this issue anymore. You know, we're going to locate it right downtown. We're going to be a secured building, but you know, we're not going to tolerate abuse in this community, and we're going to make it a visible part of the community. So, you know, are more people being abused? Perhaps not, but they're seeking services now more than ever.
And when people do call you, just so that our viewers know, everything is completely confidential.
Definitely.
Absolutely,
Right.
yes.
That's a big thing for people.
Definitely.
Yep.
You don't contact the police for them.
Nope.
Nope. No, they.
Not even if somebody came into shelter and there was an incident, we don't force them to make that call. We will say these are your options, and if you want to
Okay.
call, you can. And if they choose to, then we will be there to support them. But we will never force somebody to make a call or do something that they don't feel comfortable with.
No. One of the things we do is if someone is physically battered, and I think this is an important message, that if they come into shelter, it doesn't mean that we are going to call the police. A lot of times we'll document it, and then if later on, if it's evidence that, you know, they decide maybe another incident happens and they decide that they need to prosecute, then we have the documentation. So we encourage people. Just because you walk through the front door doesn't mean you have to take action on anything. You know, maybe you just need a shoulder, maybe someone to talk to, maybe someone to take pictures, you know, but all of that's confidential, and the photographs and all the records stay with us until maybe you decide that you want to move forward with something.
Great.
What one of the things that we wanted to talk about was the cycle of abuse. Can we kind of talk about that a little bit? And as a part of that, one of the things in this power and control wheel was, you know, some name calling. And I think at one point or another, a lot of people probably get called names. If you're just called names on a infrequent basis, does that constitute abuse?
It's all in somebody's comfort
Sure,
level, realistically. But the thing is, with the power and control wheel and with the cycle of violence, it doesn't just start on day one. The beginning of the relationship looks very much like every other relationship. It's healthy. It's all about we and us and the love and all the good stuff, and focusing on the future and what you want to have happen. And eventually, as it goes along, conflict comes out, and you're going to have conflict in any relationship, whether it's a friendship or an intimate relationship, but it's how that conflict is handled. In an unhealthy, abusive relationship, that conflict, when it's presented, the power and control tactics start coming out, the name calling, using just coercion or intimidation to kind of get that person back down and lose that, you know, lose their opinion on that particular discussion point. And then from there, the tension building continues, and then there is a battering incident. And when we talk about battering, it's not just physical. You can have a verbal assault on somebody where you just get right in someone's face, and that constitutes a battering as well. It's not just physical, and I want to stress that very, very clearly, because people, they think that, well, if I'm not being physically assaulted, then I'm not really being abused. But that emotional abuse, like I said, can be so much more debilitating, because you start to think, it's my fault. I must be doing something that's causing this. And the power and control tactics reinforce that. You know, with the name calling, well, you're just crazy. You made that up, or I never said that. Those things get inside your head, and you start thinking, well, maybe it is me. And the fact that it's happening behind closed doors and it's only happening with me, well, then I'm going to start thinking, well, my partner doesn't do this with these people or those people, only with me, so I'm going to start thinking it must be me. But that's, again, part of the power and control tactic, to get you to think that it is you. It's only you. So once that battering happens, it goes back into what's called the honeymoon. And the honeymoon oftentimes looks a lot like the beginning of the relationship, looks a lot like he's remorseful, excuse me, I don't mean to generalize, looks like your partner, it is not, looks like your partner has recognized that the abuse is unhealthy, I'm sorry, I'll change, I'll go to counseling, I'll do this and that. And so we think, well, great.
Hope.
The hope is, exactly, the hope comes up again, and you start thinking, well, it'll be better. And then it goes along for a while, and then the tension starts coming out again, and you just keep going through that whole cycle again and again and again. And every time it goes around, the abuse, that battering phase, escalates, gets worse and worse and worse. And it will just keep going around and around until somebody decides, I need to change this, whether it's the person who's experiencing the abuse or the person that is being abusive.
Well, one question on that, you know, we hear about so many different women or men who are in an abusive situation and they don't leave, you know, despite the fact that they may want to, for whatever reason they don't. Obviously, those situations don't improve. When someone has left and they turn around and go back, and I think we've all heard of a situation like that, does the abuse then tend to escalate? Does it become more
Not right
enhanced?
away. Not right away. Generally, that the reason we go back is because we see all the honeymoon things. We see all the I'm sorry. We see I'll go to counseling. I'll change. I've acknowledged that I've been doing these things. So when we return, it's the honeymoon period, and that can last a while. But then eventually, you know, if it's not true change, it's the tension is going to start again. And oftentimes people will leave and return several times. I think the average is
It's four.
4 to 7 times
Before they'll
that people will
Wow.
actually finally say, I'm done.
Can you profile the social economic status of the batterer? There's a stereotype out there that the batterer is poor, blue collar. That's not necessarily true. The batterer can be
Anybody.
a wealthy
Doctor,
athlete, politician, professor, anything, right?
The one thing that I kind of tend to tell everybody is that domestic abuse is something that it does not discriminate.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's the one thing that does not discriminate against anybody. It could happen to anyone, and it unfortunately does.
Do you find in almost all the batterers that they've never really learned how to deal with anger? Is anger at the root of this, or is it something more than that?
It's more than anger. It's having empathy for another person. It's understanding the damaging effects that you have on other people when you're verbally abusing them, when you're physically abusing them. But to answer your question, we found that about 85% of the men participating in the offender program have been victims of abuse in their childhood.
They were,
It doesn't justify their behavior. You know, they're adults and they could have sought other forms and other types of treatment. You know, what they were doing was absolutely wrong. But I think it's an astounding statistic because it shows you how intergenerational it is and how important it is that, you know, we don't like to talk about anger management because we can tell somebody, don't throw the chair because it's not the right thing to do, you're going to put a hole in the wall. But to really get down to that belief system, that cognitive, behavioral, our offender program is 44 weeks long. I mean, it's revisiting a lot of your thinking patterns and your belief systems. So, and it's proven to be very effective.
Can the courts order people into that program?
Yes, and
That's
that's
how
most of
get
them
there.
are, yeah, about 95%.
They would not do it on their own volition. Most of them.
We have about 5% that volunteer.
Really?
Yeah, we have found that because of the number of people that go through our program, I think we had 398 assessments last year of men in the program. We have found that there are men that graduate or complete the program that really liked what was happening because their lives were changing for the better. They could feel that, and they wanted to continue on at some point. We also found that there were men that probably were put on a waiting list because their probationary period and because our groups were full, that they also needed to get access to services right away. So we created a support group, which is kind of interesting because you've got the guys who are volunteers who want to be there because it was so rewarding for them, and then you have the guys that are being court ordered who say, I don't have a problem, you know, that wasn't me, she asked for it. And you mix this population together, and it's really been a good educational process for both people because the guys that finally get into the program have kind of, you know, a seed's been planted and maybe this isn't going to be as bad as what we anticipated.
Sure.
So.
Just kind of a follow-up question on that, if I could. You know, it's been referred to as the male offender program, and yet, as we've all kind of talked about tonight, it's not just men who abuse. I
No.
think that's probably the better majority of it, but there are females who
Absolutely.
abuse also.
Yes.
And what, I mean, if they're ordered into a program, do you have a program for them to go
Yep.
into?
Yes, we do.
Yep.
Okay.
It's called Choices and Consequences.
Okay.
It's a shorter program. What we've seen historically is that a lot of, just as men are, a lot of the women have been victims of abuse and have fought back and maybe, you know, the assessment that was done at the time showed that they were the primary physical aggressor. And so we work on a lot of victim work, I guess with all of them, but with the women's program it's a little bit shorter. And there are, I have stats last year through the offender program, we had about 30 women that participated in that program last year. So
We had a Surgeon General of the U.S. a few years ago who said that domestic violence and abuse should be called an epidemic. Do you think that's too strong of a term?
I think that, as we talked earlier, I think that it's always been there. I think that we're recognizing more numbers because people are seeking services. I think that our media has done a disservice to women and
What do you mean?
Well, one of the things we do in our community education process, and particularly in the preventions, is talk about our roles, our gender roles. What does it mean to be a man? Does it mean you have power and control over somebody else? What does it mean to be a woman? Well, I'm subservient. You look at MTV videos. How do they depict women as opposed to men? And that's we kind of
That
Yeah,
get
it does
desensitized.
seem, Amy, doesn't it, that usually in the most popular Hollywood films, men are reinforced or praised for solving conflicts violently.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that kind of sends that same message, that objectification of women, and that men are supposed to be the strong, burly type and, fight to solve things.
And for many years, if we're talking about male violence against women, for many years there has been this kind of stand by your man ideology
Yes.
that, okay, he has some faults, but he's great.
Yeah.
And
He's a good provider.
Right, one of his faults is that he abuses me and beats me up, but yeah, he's a good provider, and so on.
Yep.
So how do you reform media? That's
Just try to get the word out there as best we can. Try to let the public know that we're here, educate people, let them know that, like we were talking about, that abuse is not just physical abuse, that it's also emotional abuse, and it's the ideologies that we hold on to.
Do you think, we already asked the schools to do way too much, I think, but do you think the K through 12 system should be doing more?
We are so fortunate in our community because our school districts, both in Winnebago and Green Lake, and that's all of Winnebago County, have welcomed us with open arms.
Good.
And our prevention advocate can't fit his time in because there's so many requests to have him come in. We actually were able to do a half credit at the new charter school for a class on domestic violence. Both right now, I think the program was just for women or girls, young girls, but we're developing curriculum right now for young men as well. So, we live in an unbelievable progressive community when it comes to domestic abuse.
How are these programs received by the students themselves? I think back to high school.
Yep.
It was a long time ago, but my memory is still somewhat intact. I can remember a little bit. Kids back then, and I'm assuming probably even today, they just kind of poo-poo things. They sort of blow it off.
Well, they know it all already. That's why.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the presentation. I think it's the way that you present the information. Taking an MTV video is what we do with the middle school kids and the high school kids. We divide them up into girls and boys, or young men and young women, and then we have them watch the video separately. And we do this program with Reach Counseling. So we have a woman facilitator and a man facilitator of the young boys. And then they have dialogue. What did you see? How were the men represented? How are the women represented? What kind of things were happening there? And then we bring the two groups together to have a discussion. So it engages them at a level that they understand. If we were up there, dressed as a professor saying, well, this is domestic abuse and this is what it looks like, we would have lost them.
Sure.
So it's keeping that curriculum fresh and making sure it fits their level of interest, competing with MTV.
Yeah. Our teen advocate is also in the schools a lot, as well as our children's advocate. And so after the presentations, they get a lot more people stopping in and saying, well, I'd like to speak to this person, or I'd like to meet with this person. So it obviously is making an impact on the students that need it.
Good.
Sure.
So that's a really good thing.
Let's talk about some of the laws. We kind of touched this a little bit earlier, but let's make sure everyone's clear. Under current Wisconsin law, if a domestic abuse phone call is made to the police, someone has to be arrested? Is
Yes. It's called a mandatory arrest law.
All right.
And someone, or they also do dual arrests, which we prefer that they don't do. But it's...
both people get arrested?
Yes.
Right. Right. What the purpose of what was happening there is, and that law passed in 1989. What they were finding is they'd get to the scene of a crime. By the time when a victim picks up the phone and dials 911, she's afraid of losing her life. By the time police get there, things may have cooled down a little bit, and they get to the door, and she may realize, God, if he's gone, he could lose his job. What if he goes to jail? Who's going to pay rent? How am I going to get food? I don't even have a car. So she would recant and say, oh, I made a mistake. He was just having a bad day. You need to go away. Well, once that call is made, if police identify that there's been damage or that she's maybe not expressing what really happened, for her own safety, that they have a responsibility to make an arrest. So, and actually, out of that law, rippled the offender program because we were seeing an escalation in the number of men that were being, and women that were being arrested.
Has the law deterred some women from making the call? It's hard to know that.
I don't think so.
Because now when you make the call, you most people know that someone's going to be arrested.
If there's physical abuse involved, yeah.
Yep. They'll make the call just because they're afraid for their lives.
I don't know if we have any statistics on
Right,
that.
it's hard to.
It's hard to know.
that.
Yeah. One of the things that happens, though, every time there's an arrest made in the city of Oshkosh, we're notified. So we have victim packets that we send out, and then we follow up with a phone call so that they know that there are services available to them. We have a great collaboration with law enforcement and the DA's office, and Winnebago is also really fortunate to have 2 full-time investigators for domestic violence. So together, we're kind of, those arrest reports and those calls to 911 are a nice tool for us to kind of make contact.
Sure.
Right.
Can I just follow up on something
Yeah,
for
go
a
ahead.
second,
Go right
Tony? We sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to clarify something because it's something that I have heard from a number of different people, and I want to make sure that I have my information right. You had said earlier that you don't require anyone to make a phone call to law enforcement and actually, file a report. One of the things that I had heard is that domestic abuse services or shelters, not just here, but anywhere around, require that if you are going to remain in their shelter, that you file for a restraining order against the person who's physically abusing. And that sort of contrasts a little bit with what I've heard you ladies say tonight. So can you just clarify that for the folks out there?
There are some shelters that I've heard, kind of along the same lines that you have, that require you to either file a police report or try and get a restraining order. That is not something that we require simply because there are times when a restraining order may put somebody in more danger. So we, again, leave it up to that person to decide, is this good for me? Do I want to do this? Is this the step that I want to be taking with this matter?
And
so we do not require that at
right,
all.
and sometimes the shelter just needs to be a respite for a while to help you sort things out. That's really, we don't want to make calls for anybody or put anybody, in a position where things are going to escalate or where if they should make the decision to go home, that we're going to put them in a more dire position. But we do work with the clerk of courts. Anybody that seeks a restraining order in Winnebago County is referred to us. So we help them process all the paperwork.
Suppose you've got children in a family that recognize there's abuse going on between their parents. Chances are good they may be abused too. But a child recognizes that mom is just not going to go. Mom is going to deal with this or take this on. What does a child do in a situation like that? If they really recognize something is wrong and they want something done about it?
There's a couple of things that may happen. One of the positive things would be we would hope that they would maybe talk to somebody at school, talk to a counselor at school, and at least come up with a safety plan from their perspective. The negative side is sometimes kids will take on that role of I need to be the protector, and that unfortunately puts them in a much more dangerous situation because they feel they need to get in the middle of it and
Help protect
mom or dad, whoever would be the victim in that situation.
Okay.
Well, let's follow up on that for a moment. I got a lot of follow-up questions.
I know.
If a woman or a man is being abused, does that typically mean that the children and the family pets are being abused too? Or are the children usually kind of left out of this, or does it vary?
Statistically, I don't really have an answer for that, but realistically, if we're talking about emotional abuse, I mean, just by observing it, the kids are going to be affected. They're going to internalize that and they're going to take that on. So even if they're not physically being abused, that emotional damage from watching that happen or even hearing it, because a lot of times parents will say, well, we were careful not to do it around the kids, they were in the other room, and realistically, even if they're not witnessing it, they're still hearing it. Kids are a lot more perceptive than we give them credit for sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep, and the laws have changed also for children in terms of custody, physical placement. According to state statutes, which changed last year, that even children witnessing abuse are considered to have, when they're deciding with joint custody, they take that into consideration when awarding custody, whether there's been abuse, and the children witnessing it is significant enough that they would award custody differently.
Okay. You don't have to give us any numbers here, but do you ever have college students that seeks people that are mostly in relationships?
Yeah, we
that are being
actually
abused?
had a grant at the university on campus in the counseling department where we had an advocate there with, it was a collaborative grant with REACH Counseling, which is the sexual assault services. And that grant ran out last October, but we still have a half-time advocate on campus in the counseling department. And she is there to assist anybody navigating the legal system or the judicial system on campus and figuring out what to do with their restraining orders and where the incident happened, whether it was campus property or not.
Because the number I've heard thrown out is that, and to me this is shocking, 1 out of every 4 college women will be assaulted during her time at college.
I've heard that statistic.
That seems shocking to me. You've heard that statistic, right?
Yeah. But think of that critical point of a person's life college is. It's the first time where they're not under mom and dad's roof.
Right.
They're making some of their own decisions. They're participating in adult activities, more adult-like activities. So their chances of making those judgment calls, it's like coming out of the cocoon and all of a sudden seeing life for the first time. And I think that a batterer many times will prey on someone that maybe looks a little vulnerable and that kind of thing. So things will escalate during those college years.
I believe a lot of the situations that were dealt with on campus were more stalking as well.
Yes,
People were
that's
coming in and experiencing stalking situations, and so they needed safety plans or restraining orders.
And the laws have changed on stalking, have they not? I mean, for the better?
Yes, they have. It used to be stitches, broken bones to substantial battery charges. And now they're saying that, I guess that's more to do with the battery charges. But with stalking, I think they're recognizing that if there's trends in behavior, we actually have clients take a journal so they can, kind of put together what they see as a pattern.
Okay.
And we actually we got a grant recently for what we call stalking sacks, which include a disposable camera, a notepad and a pencil, and other things that could be used as tools. Because what law enforcement needs to do and the investigators is take a look at the big umbrella. Not just, well, he left a rose on my doorstep. Well, wow, how nice, how lucky you were. Well, he also called 15 times a day for the last 15 days. And, once you look at the big picture instead of just the pieces, you see a pattern.
See, I think stalking it relates back to our popular culture discussion, media, where in so much of pop culture, song lyrics, TV drama, when someone won't let someone alone, that's often defined as, I love you.
Right.
So in order for me to show you I love you,
must really love
I'm never
me.
going to leave you alone.
Right.
Yes.
And I really, most people don't want to acknowledge that pop culture has an impact on them. But from the time we're very small in this country, that's the message we get.
Yep.
Especially from pop music lyrics, which I find to be just appalling usually.
Yep.
They're almost like stalking anthems
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
in a way. Cheryl?
Yeah. What are some of the signs of abuse? We've touched on this, but give us some kind of cycle of or some kind of idea here of how someone can identify if they're being abused.
Well, the big thing that we want to tell people is to pay attention to that gut instinct. What is your gut telling you? Too often in society we kind of brush it off. I'm over exaggerating, or I'm just blowing it out of proportion. But our gut is really telling us to pay attention to certain things. And when that's telling you something, you have to pay attention to it.
That's
We call
really
that,
the key, isn't
yeah,
it?
we call
It
that
is.
red flags. You know, pay attention to the red
Yeah.
flags when you feel uncomfortable with something. There's a reason for
Mm-hmm.
it. You know, you're not just blowing it out of proportion, and it's really important to pay attention to it. Some of the red flags that we talk about is like push for early involvement. You know, moving in with somebody right away, jealousy, things like that. Obviously, past abuse, but more often than not, you're not going to know about past relationships.
Right.
And that's also kind of almost a red flag. If that person is saying, well, my ex, it was all their fault, or, you know, everything that went wrong in the relationship was this person's fault or their doing, and, you know, if there seems to be a pattern of that, or never talking about past relationships, or, you know, oh, if you see that person, you know, don't believe a word they say, you know, that's kind of a red flag to pay attention to. And so there's a whole list of them, but those are kind of the big ones. So just kind of trust your gut and pay attention to what that's telling you, and don't blow it off.
You know, along with that, and I mentioned this before, we've all come across somebody or known someone who has had some kind of an abusive type situation, whether it's emotional, verbal, physical, what have you. I personally have been in a situation where I have told someone repeatedly, you know, you really need to look at this and look at moving out of this situation. And it does, as you were talking about, Pam, it really becomes frustrating for the person's support system, because I got worn down
Yep.
just trying to help. What can people do if they know someone who's in an abusive type situation of any kind, and yet they just don't know, you know, how to get this person convinced? And I know you can't, you know,
can't
you can
convince
lead them to
them.
water, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink and that whole kind of thing. But what's your best advice?
One of the things that we have available at the shelter, and anybody can call at any time for one of these, is we have a friends and family packet that has the power control wheel, has the cycle, talks about the barriers to leaving, talks about red flags and things like that, and offers some good advice to what somebody could say to someone. Or the best advice that I could give realistically is just listen and be
Right.
there, non-judgmental, you know, attacking the person's partner, you know, oh, that person's not good for you, or this or this or that.
That's so hard,
That's
though.
just
Well,
gonna,
you
it's gonna
can't
send
when
up
you
a
see them
wall,
being
and that
abused.
person isn't even gonna hear you any longer,
Right.
because deep down they care about that person, you know, there's love there. And that's one of the things that holds you to that relationship.
Yep.
I fell in love with this person. I care about this person. I see the good side. I see the potential.
Yep.
Those things hold you there. So if I'm talking to you and I'm attacking your partner, you're going to get defensive, and you're not going to want to listen
Then
to
I'm
what I'm
not going to
saying
want
any
to be
longer.
with you anymore. You know.
So that victim may isolate themselves from you. So the best thing to do is just listen and offer, you know, well, maybe you could go and talk to somebody at a shelter or whichever area they're in, and just be there to be supportive. And it does get frustrating and wearing.
does.
But
And actually, we don't have a website, but as a resource, when you're helping a friend, there are places that you can go to how to help a friend that's in an abusive relationship. And I think the friends and family packet kind of was put together based on that, you know, the tools that you could provide for them.
All right. Let's get back to some of the nuts and bolts of the administration part of this, the funding.
Yep.
What are the funding challenges that you face?
Yeah, well, our funding is broken down in lots of different areas. Number one, we're about 49% supported by grants. Those are federal and state grants. Those cover a lot of the emergency shelter needs, the housing needs, the low-income people that come into shelter. We have staff positions, some of the staff positions that are covered by that. And then donations from the community, personal donations from you and I and different businesses in the community.
Right.
We're a United Way agency, both the Oshkosh United Way and the Fox Cities United Way, Winneconne and Berlin. We do fundraisers. One of them is coming up in the next 2 weeks, Men Who Cook for Christine Ann, which is our biggest fundraiser. And we also do a family fun run walk event in December through the Celebration of Lights. It's a collaboration we do with them. And then the smallest portion of our budget comes from the program fees from the offender program. So again, that's the only fee generating service that we offer.
You said the federal funds have been 49%, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, has that number been constant over the years, the 49%?
Yep. We were awarded a significant grant for a program we call Power a few years ago that kind of took us up a notch. That grant award is going away the end of September.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's a good segue into
Yeah.
that. I understand that we're only one of 2 communities that is.
Right. It was.
What is it?
It's a collaborative grant with ADVCAP. The opportunity came to us about 2 years ago. There were 2 awards federally in the United States, and at the time we sat down and developed the Dream Employment Package for victims of domestic abuse. What we were recognizing is ADVCAP's specialty is really working with low-income people, and they were finding that they were seeing people, but because domestic abuse issues were so prevalent, that they couldn't fit that need for them, but we could. We saw people that were on public assistance that couldn't break from that because they couldn't get employment. So together we matched our services, and we wrote this grant, and it was awarded. The acronym POWER stands for Providing Opportunities for Women's Employment and Retention. And the program has far exceeded our expectations. It has, we've had, when we first told groups of women who have been working with us for years that this was available to them, they just said, "Oh my gosh, now we have hope. I can't believe this." They were stuck. They had all the resources for advocacy and counseling, but they couldn't take it to that next step where they could become self-sufficient. So, and we were talking earlier, people's point of entry into employment is very different. Some don't have their GED. Some have their college education but haven't worked in 15 years because they've been isolated or raising their family. The physical and emotional abuse destroys a person's self-esteem and self-confidence. So, there's all these barriers that they face that are very different than someone who's like myself, who might be unemployed. Maybe my resume doesn't look good, but their barriers were so prevalent, and you could see that they were stuck. So we've had 125 women participating in the program. 70 of them are already employed full-time.
Wow, outstanding.
It is, and they range from, we have a woman that became an apprentice for as an electrician. We have a woman who got her master's at UWO in human services. We have someone who became a real estate agent. So the piece of this that's so unique and so genuine is that ADVCAP has a terrific person that sits down and says, "Now what are your goals? Where do you want to be? Where do you want to go with your life?" And then on our end of it, we have an advocate who's been with us for 13 years that can sit down and say, what are your barriers with the abuse that you need to deal with? The counseling piece so that you can move on. So it's been, I mentioned earlier, and the funding is running out at the end of September, and we're really hoping the community steps up to the plate.
Well, how much is the funding for this?
Well, the original award was $365,000 between ADVCAP and Christine Ann a year. Well, we've pared down the budget, and we're with basic skeletal services right now. It's about $115,000 is what we're looking for.
Okay. Well, I said this off camera, Cheryl, and I'll say it on camera
Sure,
too.
go right ahead.
Anyone out there who had $1 million to give for the amphitheater, we really appreciate it. But this is a very good use of charity here. It sounds like this program literally pays for itself.
Instead of just dealing with the basic needs and the safety, we're taking it the next step. These are families that are modeling employment skills for their children. You talked earlier about what happens to the kids and the intergenerational piece. Well, here's a primary care provider that's actually standing on her own. She's financially self-sufficient, so she doesn't have to go back, or he doesn't have to go back to the situation.
Did you work in this program, Amy?
In the POWER program, no. When I'm in the shelter working with the clients, we look at the employment needs, and I will refer them to the POWER program, but I don't work specifically within it. Julie Denton is our advocate that works with the POWER program, and she does a wonderful job with it.
Because the funds are so limited, and I'm sure space is limited also in the POWER program, how do you all make determinations as to who within your shelter and who of whom is receiving services makes that next step into the POWER program? How do you decide that?
Basically, anybody that has employment needs, as long as they have domestic abuse within their history, they're eligible for the program. And it's not even people that are out of their abusive situation. People that are still in it can go through the POWER program and get assistance with employment.
Out of the abusive situation, how long out of the abusive situation? I mean, 2 years, 20 years? as long as they have been in an abusive situation at some point?
Yep, we can consider all of it. We really
Really?
assess
Okay.
people one-on-one to kind of see
Sure.
where they're stuck. And,
Sure.
if we can provide services, we're going to do the best we can.
Mhm.
And, we had limitations because of the grant. It was funded by the grant. So we really hope that as people become financially self-sufficient, that they'll be able to move on and allow someone else to become involved in the program.
Mhm.
So that's really our hope for it.
And of course, donations to this are tax deductible. What are let's talk, we're running out of time, but let's talk about some of the benefits to the employers and the community as a whole. Obviously, the participants in the program themselves are great beneficiaries of the program, but other people benefit too. Let's
Yeah.
touch on that.
We talked earlier about stalking, and I think Amy mentioned that if you're trying to hold down a job and you have your perpetrator calling all the time or someone stalking you, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to lose your job. Absenteeism is a huge factor for victims of abuse. Low productivity because they're processing the relationship and how can I keep things calm at night. Well, once you start giving them the skills, you deal with the abuse piece, you've got a good quality employee who's worked really hard to become successful in what they've done. Who wouldn't want someone like that? We have people that have become community leaders that have come through power in just 2 years. So, the benefit to an employer is you're getting good quality people that have done a lot of work to get to the place they've been.
And that are motivated to get there.
Right, right. In terms of the community, these are people that typically would have been on some kind of assistance. Maybe they were on W-2 or Badger Care, and this is a way for them to become financially self-sufficient. And that benefits the community as well. That you're not having this perpetual, generational thing. Relying on the support, the government support within your community.
I know you've had supportive politicians in town. Everyone, at least gives lip service to what you're doing, but don't you think that government in Madison is not doing enough overall for this?
Well, they're under some pretty critical
Well,
budget constraints right now.
I mean, for example, one thing, I'm biased, I teach at the UW, but they are making it much more difficult for people now to get a college education.
Yes.
And doesn't that exacerbate this problem? It makes it more likely that a person will be without.
Right, if they don't have an education, are they
Yeah.
going to be employable? They're
Yeah.
competing with all these other marketplaces.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I think that we're fortunate because we have a state coalition, the Wisconsin Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we have a lobbyist that works in Madison
that's good.
that's working with the Joint Finance Committee
Oh,
right
good.
now and the Department of Health and Family Services to make sure that funding, we haven't seen an increase of funding from the Department of Health and Family Services in almost 14 years.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. All right.
That's
well,
why we need the community support. Those dollars may not be there, but
Sure.
if you have an idea of what we could do better in Madison, let us know.
All right. Well, on that note, we are unfortunately out of time. We could probably go another hour here, but there's a heck of
Easily.
a storm going on
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So we want to get these ladies home too. But thank you both very, very much for being here. And
Thank you
for the
we would love to have
opportunity.
you
Yeah.
back in the
Well, we
future,
appreciate
too.
you putting us on. If we can spread the word and we get 5 extra phone calls this week, we would just really
Sure.
welcome that.
Well, terrific. Thank you again. Tony, thanks to you. And as always, thanks to you folks for joining us and letting us in your home. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care and keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh. Bye.